Why has the international community forgotten about the civil war in Cameroon? For over a decade, a brutal conflict has raged between English-speaking separatists and the French-speaking central government that's left thousands dead and over 500,000 displaced. And yet the issue remains almost wholly ignored. There's barely any political interest, even from the Security Council, and virtually no media coverage. So, what exactly lies behind the issue, and why has this devastating conflict been all but forgotten by the rest of the world? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security, and statehood. Why do some conflicts receive global attention and yet others pass almost unnoticed? In truth, it can depend on a variety of economic, political and strategic factors. Often it comes down to great power interests. Even with a global reach, they tend to focus on areas with specific significance, such as strategic allies or valuable natural resources. Conversely, regions with little economic or military value are often overlooked. Likewise, the media also plays a part. Western news sources, which still dominate global coverage, usually focus on issues involving the United States or European countries, ignoring situations, even major ones, that don't have an immediate direct relevance. Tied to this, public advocacy is also crucial. A conflict will often gain more traction with an active lobbying campaign, even as far deadlier conflicts pass almost unnoticed. A good example of a woefully neglected conflict is the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. For almost a decade, this has been one of the deadliest conflicts in Africa, and yet it's received barely any international attention. The Republic of Cameroon straddles the boundary between Central and West Africa. At 475,000 square kilometres or 180,000 square miles, it has 6 neighbours: Nigeria, Chad, the Central African Republic, Congo, Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. It also has an Atlantic coastline. Cameroon's population is around 29 million. And it's considered to be one of Africa's most diverse countries, with over 250 ethno-linguistic groups. That said, the country's 2 official languages are French and English. However, most Cameroonians are francophone. Around 20% of the population is Anglophone and are located in the country's 2 western regions on the border with Nigeria. And this is the location of the fighting. While many conflicts, especially in Africa, have a strong colonial element, it's particularly significant in this case. Although Cameroon has a long and rich history, sitting on a key trade route between South, Central and West Africa, our story begins in the late 19th century when European powers began colonising the continent. In 1884, the Berlin Conference saw Germany awarded a territory known as Cameroon. However, German rule was short-lived. 30 years later, at the start of the First World War, Britain and France invaded the territory, dividing it up between them. While France seized most of the land, Britain took around 20%, an area that bordered Nigeria, its largest colony in West Africa. This was confirmed in 1922 when the League of Nations awarded Britain and France the mandate or legal right to administer what became known as the British and French Cameroons, thus cementing the language division at the heart of today's problems. While Britain continued its rule over the following years, overseeing the administration from neighbouring Nigeria, it now divided the territory into 2 parts: the majority Muslim North Cameroon, which shared ethnic links with the Hausa and Fulani across the border in northern Nigeria, and the predominantly Christian and animist South Cameroon. This fateful decision would become particularly significant after the Second World War, when decolonisation began and the British and French Cameroons became UN Trust territories, thus paving the way for a decision on their future. On the 1st of January 1960, the French Cameroons were granted independence, becoming the Republic of Cameroon. As questions now arose over the future of the British Cameroons, the United Nations sent several missions to the territory to assess the situation. In the end, North and South Cameroon were given two options. They could either join neighbouring Nigeria, which was then preparing for independence later that year, or unite with the Republic of Cameroon. Crucially, however, independence wasn't offered, as the two territories were considered too small and weak to be viable states. On the 11th of February 1961, referendums were held in the two territories. As expected, the population in the north voted to join neighbouring Nigeria. As a result, on the 31st of May 1961, North Cameroon united with Nigeria. In contrast, the South chose the other option. Fearing they'd be overwhelmed within Nigeria, 70% voted to unite with Cameroon. Following negotiations that many Anglophone Cameroonians still insist were illegitimate, the two parts came together on the 1st of October 1961 in what now became the Federal Republic of Cameroon. At first, it appeared that the Anglophones would be welcomed in the new country. Indeed, several English speakers held high office, including the post of Prime Minister. But despite this, tensions soon emerged. As the country's autocratic Francophone president, Ahmadou Ahidjo, began centralising power, Anglophone influence steadily decreased. This would all come to a head on the 20th of May 1972, when a referendum abolished the federation and extended presidential power. From there, things got worse. Now divided into two provinces, the English-speaking areas steadily lost more and more control, especially after the country's second and current president, Paul Biya, took office in 1982. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do give it a like and perhaps subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. By the start of the 1990s, pressure for change was growing. In 1993, several groups came together for the first All-Anglophone Conference. Calling for the restoration of the federal constitution, they began trying to highlight their plight more widely on the international stage. But even though the former Prime Minister joined the campaign, it made little headway. As a result, when the conference met for its second meeting the following year, the groups announced that if their demands weren't met, they'd begin pressing the case for independence. However, the government refused to bend. Rather than discuss this situation, it began erasing the last elements of decentralisation. At the same time, it cracked down on separatist sentiment, arresting anyone involved in growing anti-government protests. But while all this succeeded in stopping political unrest by the turn of the millennium, deeper resentment remained strong. It was against this backdrop that tensions re-emerged in late 2016. This time, the unrest followed a series of protests sparked by the growing number of French speakers appointed to teach at the region's schools or staff government offices. But as the government launched yet another crackdown on dissent, several armed groups now emerged, sparking violent confrontations with security forces. This situation dramatically escalated on the 1st of October 2017, when several groups declared independence on the anniversary of the creation of the Federal Union. Named after a short-lived 19th century British protectorate of freed slaves that had been created in Ambazonia, they announced the establishment of the Federal Republic of Ambazonia. However, while most pro-independence groups still wanted a peaceful process, and many others merely wanted a return to federalism or even decentralisation, the central government refused to discuss the issue and instead sent in more troops. But rather than quelling opposition, as had happened before, this just made matters worse. As a result, by mid-2019, the fighting had escalated dramatically. No longer confined to clashes between rebel groups and the government forces, civilians were now increasingly affected. Indeed, estimates suggested that several thousand had already died and many more had been forced to flee their homes, many into neighbouring Nigeria. Meanwhile, as rebels increasingly targeted schools, causing thousands of children to stay at home, violence was also spreading to neighbouring French-speaking areas. As a full-blown civil war became increasingly likely, President Biya agreed to talks and proposed several measures. These included a special status for the Anglophone regions, direct elections for regional governors, and significant infrastructure projects. However, while some argued that these were meaningful steps towards autonomy, the proposals fell far short of the federal settlement that many now wanted. But while reports suggested that the government had opened secret talks with jailed activists, a claim it denied, the fighting steadily worsened, sparking ever more atrocities. For example, a rebel attack on a school in October 2020 that killed many children was explicitly condemned by the UN Secretary-General. Since then, although several efforts have been made to stop the fighting, including a Canadian attempt in 2023, a settlement remains out of reach. While Biya continues to reject calls to restore the federal arrangements, separatist groups have become more entrenched in their calls for independence. Meanwhile, the violence has continued, as both sides now stand accused of numerous human rights abuses, ranging from kidnappings, extortion, and the use of child soldiers by the rebels, through to arbitrary arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings by government forces. Serious clashes continue. To put all this in a broader perspective, over the past 9 years, it's estimated that over 6,000 people have been killed and more than 500,000 have been displaced. In addition, it's believed that almost 2 million people now require humanitarian assistance in one form or another. All this makes the Anglophone crisis one of the deadliest ongoing conflicts in Africa. And yet, despite the mounting toll of lives lost and ruined, it's hardly reported outside the region. Likewise, there's barely any political interest. Indeed, the UN Security Council has held just one meeting to discuss the situation. This was back in 2019. So, just why is the issue passed unnoticed? There are, in fact, several distinct reasons. For a start, given the persistent efforts by Cameroon to play down the crisis, few Western governments want to get too involved, especially France and the United States. Both regard Cameroon, which neighbours several critically insecure states, as an essential partner in broader efforts to fight Islamist insurgents operating in northern Nigeria and across the Sahel region. Moreover, few want to criticise, let alone pressure, President Biya, especially France, which has long supported the regime and maintains essential economic and political interests in Cameroon. Even Britain's involvement has been relatively limited, despite its historical part in the story. Although Cameroon joined the Commonwealth in 1995, becoming the first territory not exclusively British-ruled to do so, the UK has avoided direct involvement, restricting its interventions to statements of concern. Meanwhile, the conflict, which lacks the direct great power interest and geopolitical significance of the conflicts in Ukraine or the Middle East, remains largely ignored by the international media. At the same time, the complexity of the conflict, coupled with the moral ambiguity of the situation, which has seen armed groups on both sides committing atrocity, makes it less appealing for mainstream media. Moreover, Cameroon's harsh press restrictions and the difficulty and danger of getting into the conflict zone limit the opportunities for independent reporting. Finally, lacking large and well-organised interest groups, there's little incentive for the media to take a closer interest. Meanwhile, without sustained media attention, international public pressure remains weak, allowing the crisis to persist largely unnoticed. But what makes the situation particularly tragic is that it all seems so unnecessary. A ready solution to the crisis always seemed possible if the government was willing to seize the opportunity. Instead, the issue has been allowed to rumble on, largely unnoticed, for the better part of a decade, ruling the lives of millions of people. The question, of course, is whether an acceptable solution might yet be found with some more media attention and some more international pressure. I hope you found that helpful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find useful. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.